There's an ongoing struggle. Democracy is not an event. It's not that you'll ever stop working towards, attaining that perfect society. And so there will always be a struggle. There will always be an ongoing struggle to hold both public and private power to account. And the only way in which you can use what we currently have, which I think is a massive asset of a civil society in South Africa, and to use that properly and to use it effectively, is for donors to be able to work together, which we are trying to do.
The power of collaboration for me has always been when it's organic and when it's driven by the sector themselves. Collaborations fail most when it's donor driven. And so I think donors we need to use our convening power in a way that's strategic, thoughtful, and in consultation with the sector.
We convene our grantees and partners regularly, but we also convene when we feel that there is an exciting initiative that maybe doesn't fall within our area of funding, and we convene other donors around that. And we also convene more and more around an area that we think is important, but we don't see any activity. Convening in general, if done well, as Atlantic used to do, can be a very positive intervention in the sector. But I think as a donor you have to be very careful about how you do it.
For instance, when I joined MOT, there was no particular focus necessarily by Atlantic on advice offices. But when I started to chat to Gerald about it, he was very responsive, and he actually, we started to fund some of the grantees that MOT was funding around that space. And we also, as MOT, started to fund some of Atlantic's grantees, for instance, Rhodes University. It's been a really wonderful partnership, especially because Atlantic also gave larger grants than MOT. So it was very, useful for us to have that partnership, because it ensured sustainability of the work of grantees and stability, a fair level of stability amongst the grantees that we co-funded.
I think we have a much more powerful role to play in convening the philanthropy field, local philanthropy, the corporate sector, the corporate social responsibility sector. There, I think we can play a much more proactive role, convene people in that space to talk about what it means to engage with social justice philanthropy. What does it mean for you as foundations to partner with local foundations? What are we learning? What are they learning?
We have constraints in that, for a long time people have talked about donors coming together and developing one proposal format or one reporting format, because it puts a huge burden on our grantees. It's very difficult. There's not the will, really, I think, to do it, because we don't have to. We're the ones with the resources, with the money, with the power, and it's easier for us to have our own formats that meet the requirements of our boards. But in actuality, we could do it. I think we could do a better job at it, certainly.
We often accuse the sector of being fragmented, but we don't look at ourselves in terms of how we contribute to that fragmentation. And I think donor coordination and collaboration is important to help strengthen the sector and not fragment the sector. I think the Atlantic Forward collaboration has always been easy because we come from the same kind of mission and values base. It's often very difficult if you're coming from a corporate social investment perspective or a bilateral perspective, or these different competing interests at play. But I don't think that means we shouldn't collaborate with people who don't think the same way. But I do think we need to recognize the difficulties around collaboration where there's a values mismatch. I think collaboration is a good thing because it teaches us to leave our strategies at the door and come together collectively and decide what's best for the sector. It's very easy when you're operating on your own as a donor to get caught up in your own strategy and your own processes and miss the big picture.
When it came to Atlantic Philanthropists, for example, because they were a large donor, they used that well, I think, to bring other donors together. So in terms of the multi-agency grant initiative, Maggie, which was really set up by HEWOS and Atlantic, that's a great example, I think, of donors collaborating.
interesting about the Maggie initiative, well, it's the Multi-Agency Grants Initiative, was Ford joined that initiative quite late. It was really spearheaded by Atlantic and HIVOS at the beginning. But it was a group of donors coming together and identifying a gap in the sector and saying, as international funders, we recognize that the edgiest things are often happening at very local level, at grassroots level, amongst community-based organizations. And we struggle to get money to communities because of our own restrictions, because of our legal status, because we require 3 years of audited financial statements, and we could be missing something. And the idea was, what if we could develop a mechanism that made it easier for funders to get money to this sector? So we've adjusted the strategy over the years, we've evaluated Maggie, and it's always been about the joint effort and a joint vision around community-based organizations, not about individual donors. I think the great thing about Atlantic, HIVOS, Ford, Mott, in the Maggie collaboration has been, it's been about so much more than just money. It's been about what we can learn together, how we can bring the sector together through our own collaboration, and how we can enhance the work that we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. And I think those collaborations are often the most powerful, and it's often the hardest to work at. But if it's just about pooling money into joint funding mechanisms, that's not necessarily collaboration, and it's not necessarily about the sector. That's about getting money out the door as quickly as possible.
The other foundation is part of a trend in recent years of establishing African institutions that are authentically rooted, owned, and informed by African life realities and experience. We see the other foundation as part of an historic project of creating the institutional architecture for philanthropy in Africa that hopefully will last in perpetuity.
In my time, we've worked quite closely on several initiatives, the most important being the launch of the Constitutionalism Fund for South Africa, which is a 10-year fund to support and advance human rights organizations in South Africa and to support the essence and the spirit of our Constitution, which basically will give effect, we hope, over time to the values that underpin our Constitution, the rights to dignity, equality, non-discrimination, all of the issues that are very close to the heart and the mission of Atlantic as well as Ford and Open Society. And that fund really was the result of Atlantic's exit from South Africa and sort of the eventual closure of its offices. And the idea was to, part of several initiatives that Atlantic was going to invest in on leaving South Africa, was to make quite a sizable contribution to a joint fund of international donors to ensure that 20 years after our democracy and for the next 20 years going forward, that there would be some kind of meaningful investment in building up the core strength of organizations that all of us have historically funded.
Donor collaboration at Mott is a major part of the way we work. You know, it doesn't always have to be, you know, pooling of funds. We initiated a loose network of donors just to get together and figure out how those grantees could be supported, given the gap that they would experience after Atlantic had left. And so we started with a few donors, Wraith Foundation, Ford Foundation. We even had the NDA in some of the meetings, even the lotteries, and then later Open Society. And so that network actually has continued.
The big contribution that probably has been overlooked when it comes to strengthening local philanthropy was actually their assisting us to drive, and they funded a big donor conference in 2010, which brought together for the first time international private foundations with local foundations. And out of that conference, a resolution was taken at the end on the third day to create a network of private philanthropists within South Africa. And that actually seeded what became known as the Private Philanthropy Circle and is now a formalized independent philanthropy association of South Africa. And Atlantic may not be aware of the contribution they made, but this brings together now private foundations with an annual spend in the region of 1.5 billion rand. And the cooperation, the affinity groups, the working together, the building a community of practice on philanthropy in South Africa has emerged out of that network. So I still think there's a long way to go in bringing local philanthropy together, but actually that was seeded by Atlantic.